Both diffusion and osmosis involve the movement of molecules with an existing concentration gradient and do not require the use of energy. However, sometimes cells need to move molecules against a concentration gradient or to maintain a concentration gradient. For example, a plant's root cells may need to absorb nutrients from the soil water surrounding the roots. If the concentration of those nutrients is lower outside the cells and higher inside the cells, it needs to move those nutrients against a concentration gradient. And how does this occur? In order to move substances against the concentration gradient, cells use a process called active transport. It is referred to as active because it requires energy. Active transport occurs through transport proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. Cells use active transport to move substances from where it is less concentrated to where it is more concentrated. And it does this through the transport proteins. The energy for active transport comes from a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. ATP is a product of cellular respiration and can be thought of as the energy molecule that cells use to perform their normal functions. ATP can be broken down into a molecule called adenosine diphosphate, or ADP for short, and a free phosphate group. And energy is released in this process. And this energy can be used for active transport. So an example of active transport occurs after you eat a meal. Nutrients like glucose from the food you have eaten absorb into the cells lining the inside of the small intestine. If diffusion alone was involved, once the concentration of glucose inside and outside of the cells became equal, there'd be no net movement of glucose. This means that some of the glucose available from the digestion of your food would not permeate into the cells of your intestine and would be excreted. In reality, glucose continues to move into the cells lining the small intestine, even when its concentration is lower outside of the cell. This is because the cells actively move the glucose through transport proteins. So another classic example of active transport is the sodium-potassium pump. Cells must contain high concentration of potassium ions. So if this is our cell membrane and this is inside the cytoplasm, these yellow squares represent the potassium ions. And cells need a high concentration of potassium ions inside the cell. They also need a low concentration of sodium ions inside the cell. And they need this in order to perform many functions. In animals, for example, sodium and potassium ion gradients are essential for nerve and muscle function. The sodium-potassium pump is actually this protein which is embedded in the cell membrane, and it uses energy released in ATP to move potassium ions into the cell and sodium ions out of the cell. And in each case, the ions move from where they are less concentrated to where they are more concentrated. So the process by which this occurs is, firstly, the sodium ions that are in the lower concentration inside of the cell bind to the transport protein. ATP is then converted to ADP, releasing energy and transferring the phosphate group to the protein. So the free phosphate group actually attaches itself to the protein here. The phosphate group then changes the shape of the protein, moving the sodium ions across the membrane and out of the cell against the concentration gradient. 2 potassium ions, so 1, 2 potassium ions from outside of the cell then bind to the protein, causing the phosphate to release from the transport protein. So here is the phosphate group now releasing from where it was attached to the protein. The release of the phosphate group in step 4 changes the shape of the protein, allowing the potassium ions to then move into the cytoplasm. The pump is then reset and can repeat this process. In comparison to passive transport, active transport moves molecules across membranes extremely fast. In the case of a nerve impulse, for example, the sodium-potassium pump can send an electrical impulse down the length of a nerve cell in a fraction of a second. Think about how quickly you react to pull your hand away from a hot plate or a flame when you burn yourself. This is due to the speed of the sodium-potassium pump.